Bons conselhos, a economia das parábolas.
A mediação vai ser do diretor do Fórum da Liberdade e do IEE, Matheus Macedo. É contigo, Matheus.
Senhoras e senhores, muito boa tarde. Bem-vindos ao Fórum da Liberdade. Bem-vindos a esse grande evento de liberalismo. Quando falamos em liberalismos e quando estudamos liberalismo, sobretudo, nós recorremos às escolas. Primeiramente, a escola de Chicago e o célebre Milton Friedman. Também se estuda bastante a escola austríaca, que data do início do século passado, e aí nós sempre lembramos de autores como Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, e é sempre salutar citá-los pela grande contribuição que eles nos deixaram por meio das suas obras. Há ainda alguns que chegam até a origem do liberalismo, o iluminismo britânico. E aí nos deparamos a autores como John Locke, John Stuart Mill e até mesmo a Adam Smith, que é considerado o pai da economia. O curioso é que pouco se estude do que veio para trás, ou seja, do que veio antes. Ora, sabemos que por muito tempo a Igreja foi a instituição mais poderosa que existiu na Europa, quiçá até no mundo. Seria muito pouco provável que nada de conhecimento econômico tenha surgido daquela que foi a grande detentora do conhecimento por nada mais, nada menos do que 10 séculos, um milênio. A Escola de Salamanca e os seus grandes autores, como Francisco de Vitória, Domingos de Soto, Luiz de Molina, Francisco Soares, Tomás de Mercado, Matteo Liberatore e muitos outros, nos trazem uma grande certeza. O reverendo Robert Sirico não é o primeiro teólogo a aliar a fé com o livre mercado. Essa parte da história do pensamento liberal e até mesmo do pensamento econômico nos parece ter sido escondida. Vivendo no país católico mais populoso do mundo, a reflexão se faz mais do que necessária. Jesus Cristo falava em parábolas a fim de que pudesse passar a sua mensagem de modo claro, acessível, direto e transparente. As parábolas são assim, por serem assim de fácil compreensão, são também situações que vivemos no nosso dia a dia e que estão presentes, algumas delas, até hoje, na nossa vida cotidiana. A partilha de uma herança, por exemplo, a condução de um dilema familiar, eram situações da época e que seguem se repetindo hoje. Mas, acima de tudo, a grande lição dela, o que nós podemos tirar efetivamente, enquanto as parábolas servem de pano de fundo, é que os recursos são escassos e a correta alocação deles é a chave para uma decisão sábia, para uma decisão inteligente e da qual vamos nos orgulhar dos frutos por ela gerados. Jesus Cristo, senhoras e senhores, não foi, então, um economista, até porque a economia como ciência sequer existia à época. Mas essas parábolas, as parábolas de Jesus Cristo, são sim lições econômicas. Lições essas que o reverendo Robert Sirico reuniu em sua obra, intitulada A Economia das Parábolas. Lançada com o título em inglês The Economics of the Parables, a obra reúne 13 das parábolas do Novo Testamento, da Bíblia, e mostra não apenas como elas são compatíveis com as teorias do livre mercado, mas, mais do que isso, como elas até corroboram, muitas vezes, mutuamente, uma com a outra. Depois do primeiro lançamento do ano passado, lá nos Estados Unidos, esse é o primeiro lançamento fora do país de origem do autor. E quis o destino, ou talvez a providência, que ela fosse lançada pela segunda vez justamente aqui, nesse Fórum da Liberdade, o berço do liberalismo no Brasil e um dos maiores eventos pró-economia do mundo. Que honra a nossa ter o Robert Sirico conosco. Reverendo, por favor, venha ao palco.
Thank you very much. Jesus Christ was a socialist. The first communists were the early Christian church.
Tá.
Private property is theft,
Tu tem como?
and it is greed, the vice of greed, that animates the free market capitalist system. You've heard all of this, haven't you? This is the presumption of many intellectuals. It's the presumption of many theologians, of many people in the church, that the moral system is the system of socialism, that the solution to poverty in the world is the redistribution of wealth. I used to believe that. I was involved in protests in the 1970s on the streets of California. I knew Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. I worked in various of the social change movements of the day, many of which are now prominent movements today, very powerful movements shaping the history of nations. But one day, I made the mistake of getting into an argument with a man who knew a lot more than I did about history and economics. And he took mercy on me. After a few minutes of conversation, he said, "You are delightfully stupid, and I am going to educate you." And now, being from Brooklyn, if you want to be my friend, it has to begin with a big argument. And I don't mean Brooklyn in Sao Paulo, I mean Brooklyn in New York. And we began to have a series of discussions. And I remember one day on my birthday, it must have been my 26th or 27th birthday, so you get an idea of how long ago it was. He showed up at my apartment, we were going to have dinner, and he had two arms loaded with books. He knocked on the door and I said, "Come on in." He said, "I can't, my arms are full." And I opened the door and there he was with two arms loaded with books. He walked over to my couch and he just threw the books on the couch. He said, "Happy birthday, Sirico, read." And among those books were the books I see on sale out here. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Friedrich Bastiat's The Law. Wonderful book because it doesn't teach you what to think, it teaches you how to think. I began to read all of those books, Ayn Rand, all of those books. I was away from my faith at the time, so the question of religion wasn't the primary question I was interested in. But what's interesting is all of those things I said that socialism says about the free market are moral arguments. They never say that the socialist arrangement is going to produce more wealth, only that it will distribute it. And as I began to read very systematically about economic ideas, over a period of about 6 months, my whole political, economic orientation began to change. It was like a light went on in the room slowly, and all of a sudden the room was illuminated. And I had a great deal of trouble with this because I had a lot of friends and a lot of commitments to various demonstrations and political causes that we were involved in. I went to my friends and asked questions, and all they kept saying was, "Oh, don't listen to that, that's fascism, that's, and all this kind of stuff," but no arguments. So I continued to read and ask questions about it. And finally, I conceded that he was right. And I think the thing that provoked that was one day, here's what really put it into focus for me. He said, "After all, what is it you want?" I said, "I want justice in the world. I want to make a world a better place for the people who are the most vulnerable." Because I had seen human vulnerability when I was growing up in New York, when I lived among people who had just come from Europe after the Second World War and had tattoos on their arms, who knew what it was to live under a different kind of socialist regime. And I wanted to make a world a better place. And he said, "What is it you want? How would you go about doing that? What practically would you do? If I gave you one wish," he said, "what would it be?" I said, "Well, that's easy. We redistribute all of the wealth of the world." He said, "You make everybody equal?" He said, "Yes, everyone becomes equal." He said, "Okay. Your wish is granted. Imagine what the world would look like then." I said, "That's great." He said, why is that great? I said, because many of the people who have so much will have less, but enough to live on. And then those who have nothing will be brought up. You know the whole socialist argument. And he said, and this is where he got me. He said, fine, it's done. What happens the next day? And I said, what do you mean what happens the next day? He said, well, what do people do the next day, practically speaking? What happens? I said, well, they go about their business. He said, what would that be? I said, well, they go to work. He said, well, stop right there. Where are they going to work? And I didn't understand what he was talking about. I'm embarrassed to admit this at this point now, knowing as much as I do about economics, that I didn't know that. And he said, you think that the wealth of the wealthiest people in the world is invested in their jewels and their cars and their homes and their boats and their planes. I said, well, of course. He said, no. The vast majority of the wealth of the wealthiest people in the world is invested in investment, which means it's invested in business, which means the day after you redistribute the wealth of the world, there aren't going to be any businesses. People would have to begin starting businesses again in order to live, in order to support their families, in order to earn money. He said, and the whole thing would start all over again. I was bewildered by this. It was one of these thoughts that make you think about everything and question everything. And so I began to shift my way of thinking. What's interesting that happened to me was that as I began to think about these broad ideas written by secularist writers, as I said, Hayek and Mises and Rand, I also began to think of some questions that had been taught to me as a child in New York. I'm an Italian American in New York. We were largely a culturally religious family, not particularly devout. But I remember in catechism class, the teacher, the nun, teaching us about what I know now was the natural law, how things are in reality, that who human beings are. And as I was thinking about these economic thoughts, I thought about what that nun said, and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden actually, it took several years, I began to think that the moral foundations of society rest in the reality of who human beings are. And what I learned about human beings at first and foremost was from this anthropology, which is Christian anthropology. Now I know that a lot of people think that socialism is antithetical to, that capitalism is antithetical to Christian worldview, to the biblical worldview. But I want to give you in a very brief form right now my argument against that idea. And it starts on the first page of the Bible in the Garden of Eden, where it describes God making the heavens and the earth. It's very interesting. If you look at these metaphors, I'm not proposing this to you as some kind of scientific theory. Think of this as the moral lesson that is being taught, the lesson about human anthropology that is being taught, that God makes the heavens and the earth and then forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into this man the breath of life. So man is two things in this conception of the world, of the human person. Man is two things. He is the dust of the earth and the breath of life. He has two dimensions, physicality and transcendence. And God situates man and woman in a garden. Now, what's the difference between a garden and a jungle? The garden requires maintenance. It requires pruning. It requires work. This is the whole beginning concept, the primordial understanding of the biblical idea of who human beings are and where they are in reality. It could have been anything, but it was this. What is economics? Economics is the careful use of scarce resources to supply the needs that human beings have. When God says to man and woman in Genesis to work, he's giving them the command to tend this garden. The whole setup that human beings are placed in is the world of economy. Not as an ideological concept, not as a mathematical concept, but as a human reality. Human action is what is required in order to survive in the world. And this human person, in the biblical concept, has a mind, is free, is made in the image and the likeness of God. And in order for this man and this woman to survive, they have to use their mind to draw from the earth the resources of the world, the things that are needed, the scarce resources that are needed to supply their needs. In order to use reason, you have to be free. And you may say, well, animals are physical beings, right? Yeah, but animals relate to the material world in ways that are different than the way man and woman relates to the material world. Man is bound to the material world by reason, by his mind. It's his mind that figures out how to draw from nature things that are useful to human survival. Animals don't do that. I know somebody says, well, animals do that. Birds build nests and beavers build dams, but there's a difference. Human beings, because of our reason, have the ability to reflect on what they are doing. And not only that, they have the ability to reflect upon their reflection. And that is what enables man to build not just a dam, not just a house, but many houses. You've never seen a beaver build a lot of dams and rent them out to other beavers. Human beings can build culture. Human beings can build civilization if they are allowed to use their reason to draw from nature the things that are necessary for human sustenance. This is the biblical worldview, and this is the whole process that I'm going through as I'm reading this, and then go back to the church and go into theology, study in seminary. When I got there, I found all of the same kind of socialist ideas in seminary that I had been promoting on the streets of Los Angeles those many years ago. I can continue throughout the scriptures and show you how private property is sacred according to the scriptures. Thou shalt not steal. Let's start there. Why is private property sacred? Private property is sacred because human beings mix their labor with the material world and draw out of the material world, as I said, things that are necessary for our sustenance. It comes from our freedom and our reason. And that's why the intimate connection between property and the human person is so important. In fact, if you don't have property, you can't have freedom, because property is the way in which we make our freedom factually present in our world. This whole cosmology and anthropology of the scriptures and of the traditions of the church reinforce the notion that human creativity based on reason, based on freedom, is moral, is seen also in the sacraments of the church. At least in my faith, the Catholic faith, sacraments are those outward signs of an inward grace. Every one of the sacraments has some physical dimension to it. In baptism, it's water that shows us the washing away of sin. In marriage, the physical outward sign of the inward grace of matrimony is actually, and this may shock some people, is not the marriage ring, it's not the candles, it's the conjugal union, the sexual union of man and woman. That in the tradition of the church, our physicality is something that is holy when used appropriately, when used rightly. And in the Eucharist, the preeminent sacrament of the Church, the source and the summit of faith, what is it that Jesus gives to continue his presence? It's bread and wine. Note, not grapes and grain. Bread and wine. And what's the difference? Bread has undergone human work. The fruit of the vine and the work of human hands. So that work has a certain dignity in the Christian vision of the world, in the Jewish vision of the world for that matter. All of these things I began putting together in my seminary days. And I began to be very concerned as I read the corpus of liberation theology, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that. That I decided I had to combat this. And I ended up doing it by founding an institute, the Acton Institute, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with my colleague Chris Maurin, who is now the president of the Institute. Basically, what we try to do is have conferences like this, especially for business people and future religious leaders, helping them to understand these connections between economics and morality, economics, and the truth of who human beings are. The Christian proposition is that the material world is good and that it points to something higher. And in fact, the parables do that in a beautiful way. I just wrote a book on the parables. It's for sale. I saw it just beneath Ludwig von Mises' Human Action out here, and I was very happy to see that. What the parables are stories that begin with regular human existence. People say to me, how could there be economics in the parables? And I say, how could there not be? Because the whole of our life is involved with making decisions about use of scarce resources. And there's one parable I want to tell you about, and I elaborate on in the book. I want to close with this parable for you to think about. It's the parable of the talents. If you don't know the story, it takes place in the book of Matthew, and it talks about a man who goes on a journey but leaves some resources for 3 of his servants. And to one he gives 5, to one he gives 2, to one he gives 1. And the gospel begins by saying he gave to each according to his ability. The master knew who these servants were, and he assigns them these talents. He says, now be productive with them, and when I come back, I'll collect the profits. I'm putting it in my own language. And he goes away, and the servants go about their job, and then he returns, and he comes to the one, and he says, what have you done? He said, you gave me 5, I've produced 10. He said, well done. He goes to the one who had 2, he says, I've produced 4. Well done. He comes to the last one, and this is very interesting, especially on an economic level. He comes to the last one, and the last man says, here's the talent you gave me. I hid it. I buried it. And here, I give it back to you. And the master said, how could you do that? Why didn't you at least give it to the banker so it could have gotten interest? And this is the man's defense of himself. And see if this does not sound familiar to you. He says to the master, the generous master, who entrusts him with the talent, which is, by the way, a unit of money that's very substantial. He says to the master, I knew you were a hard man, gathering where you have not scattered, harvesting where you have not sown. And so I hid my talent. Where have you heard that accusation before? I suggest you've heard it in the Communist Manifesto. Isn't that the attitude of socialists toward entrepreneurs? They're hard people. They exploit. They gather and enrich themselves on what they have not themselves invested. They're hard. Well, I'll leave you to read the gospel to see what happens to that servant. But the reality is this. My belief is that each one of us has been entrusted with a talent. Each of us has been given some responsibility in the world. Each of us is given a vocation to work in our world, and if we're free and we can use our reason, we can produce more than we consume. That is what makes the world wealthy. The solution to poverty is not the redistribution of wealth, it is the creation of wealth. That just makes sense on the face of it. That the nations that have had the freest economies have been the nations that have helped the poor more. Why? Because they let the poor help themselves. That's what dignity is. My hope for each of you who have been entrusted with a talent is that you will be productive with that talent, creative with that talent, even risk, which is part of entrepreneurship. Those servants had to risk. They could have lost. To be risking in a prudential way with your talents, to be generous with them, and to be other-regarding, looking to other people and collaborative with other people. Because that is the only way in which you can be a true servant. If you will do that, then my prayer for each of you is that on that last day, when all of the wrongs of the world will be made right, you will hear the voice of that master say what he says to the servants in that gospel. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You have proven yourself faithful in small things. Now come and enter your master's joy. Thank you very much.
Father Sirico, thank you again for coming, and thank you for launching your book here in Brazil, the Liberty Forum.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Acton Institute, which you founded, has been a partner with IE and Liberty Forum for many years.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about your personal conversion? How did you become from a socialist to a pro-art activist, and how did you find Acton?
Well, I told some of that story in my speech, but it's obviously far more intricate than that. I hadn't been to university at that time when all of that was happening. There was no tradition in my family of going to university. We were working class people in New York, and as I began to read, I mean, you try and pick up Ludwig von Mises' Human Action and read it if you have no background in any of it. And I asked my friend, I said, you know, I can read Bastiat, I understand that. I understood Hayek pretty well, but then I got into some of these other books and I said, what do I do? Are there some books that I can read before I read these other books? And he said, yes, there's a wonderful invention. And I said, what is that? He says, it's called the university. And so I went to university and began to read very systematically the tradition, and that's really where my vocation to become a priest had really emerged over those years of study of history, of philosophy, of economics. And then when I came out and went into seminary, it was there that the idea of Acton was born, because Alejandro Chafuen, who is here, an Argentinian, we were meeting at the Mount Pelerin Society meeting in Antigua, Guatemala in 1990. And I said to Alex, I said, I have some ideas to write on these themes. He said, well, it'd be very good, you know, but you're thinking too small. And I said, why? He said, why don't you clone yourself? Why don't you create an institute that presents these ideas across the board? And that's when the idea for Acton started, and I went back to Grand Rapids and founded it in 1990.
Great. Alejandro Chafuén, que foi mencionado, estará no palco Arena amanhã, no outro palco.
We'll be in arena stage with a panel. We can still call ourselves liberals.
Tell us more about the economics of the parable. In which context did you write the book, and why did you choose those 13 parables?
One of the best things for me that came out of COVID was to write that book. Because, of course, as a priest, I've been preaching. I've been a priest 34 years now. And I had been preaching on the parables for all of those years, and yet working in the area of classical liberal ideas, and seeing the two worlds. And of course, my whole job is to bring these two worlds together. So I began sitting down and did some research over maybe 10 years, just would write little things here and there, and then finally got some people to help me put together some more things systematically. Then COVID hit, and I sat down and finished the whole project. And so that's what I chose those parables, and there could be others. I chose 13 of them because they most clearly exemplify. I think, especially if you're not a believer, I think if you read those parables, you yourself will be surprised. That's what's interesting about this book. If you're not a believer and you read them, you're going to be shocked to see how much economics is in them. And if you are a believer, you're going to be shocked to see how much is there that you may not have missed before. So. And then the afterword of the book, which is about a third of the book, responds to a lot of these questions that we're asking that people always have in their minds. I mean, didn't Jesus say the rich man has to give up all of his wealth to get into heaven, that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven? I answer that question in there. I can answer it now, but then maybe people won't buy the book.
It's very cheap. For the reals, it's a cheap book.
Did we not price it properly?
Yeah.
I thought you were capitalists here.
Okay. We were supposed to be. Yeah, we can adjust. Well, how do you see? There is a phenomena here in Brazil that's not very well known, but I'm sure in this room many people will know the theology of liberation. How do you see that in Brazil and the United States as a parallel, and how do you see it still influence the economics and the politics of Brazil and the role?
Well, I'll start with the last question first. How do I see the politics of Brazil? It is as insane as the politics of the United States. It's amazing and chilling how they've paralleled each other and the political division. And I think this is not healthy for our societies. People have to be able to collaborate and work together even when they disagree with one another. And right now we're at a point where people aren't even talking to one another. And part of that is the rejection of reason in society. Liberation theology is a very, let's say, flexible idea. It morphs, it changes. So you can have various forms of liberation theology that are spiritual but then become economic or even revolutionary. You had some of the most prominent liberation theologians in the whole corpus right here from Brazil. Yeah. Liberation theology is a fundamental attempt to baptize Karl Marx. What it tries to do is take socialist economic analysis and translate it into the Gospels. It's the opposite of what I did in my book. What I did in my book, and I challenge anybody to read it and say differently, I did not try to put into the Gospels my economic ideas. What I tried to do was pull out of the Gospels certain presuppositions. Let me take a moment to say that I don't believe that Jesus was an economist. I don't believe the Gospels were written to teach us economics. But I think the Gospels reflect a certain truth of the human reality. And part of the truth of the human reality is the economic truth. I don't think that economic truth is the whole truth, but I think it's an important part of the truth. And liberation theology distorts that. What liberation theology tries to do is bring about the kingdom of God here and now through human revolution. The idea, Gustavo Gutierrez, who's a Peruvian, basically said that we have to have class warfare to liberate the rich from their sin. And it's the antithesis of the Christian vision. I thought one of the best responses to the whole Marxist idea came from Mother Teresa of Calcutta, of all things. She said, "We do not believe in class warfare, we believe in class encounter, where the rich save the poor and the poor save the rich." The resilience of Marxism is that it continually fosters the idea of an innate hostility between classes of people. Marx starts with the economic classes, but then you see it goes down the line historically. Then you have the radical feminist idea that there's an intrinsic hostility between man and women, or the radical environmentalist idea that there's an intrinsic hostility between the human person and the environment in which he lives, or the geopolitical national concern about people who are indigenous versus people who are who have come later, or now in the sexual revolutions that there's an intrinsic hostility between, say, gays and straights. I know my language is antiquated, but I'm antiquated. So, and what Marxism does is lay on top of all of these sociological realities a revolutionary contention that what we need to resolve these differences is warfare of one form or another, rather than some kind of encounter where people begin to understand each other better. They may not agree with each other, but at least we understand each other better and can cooperate with one another.
Thank you. Well, we have many questions from the audience. I will read some of them. Thank you for everyone who are sending those questions. I have a question from André Hofmeister. He asking your thoughts on the Pope Francis, and how do you see him when he goes on, when he supports socialist ideologies?
I think that Pope Francis, like many Argentinians, is a complicated person. And I'm going to say something that maybe many of you will not agree with. I do not think that Pope Francis is a real socialist. I don't think he's a Marxist. I don't think he thinks in those categories.
Just a Peronist.
Yeah, Peronist, yes. And I think that if you want to categorize him politically, I think you would have to say a Peronist. One of his biographers said that he quotes him as saying, "I don't understand economics and I find it boring. I don't understand economics." So I want to say that I agree fully with Pope Francis. He doesn't understand economics because on the one hand, he calls for business people to produce wealth, and on the other hand, he advocates programs that would repress the production of wealth. He, at moments, seems to think that you need to create wealth in order to solve poverty, and in other moments, he wants a massive redistribution of wealth. So I think on the area of economics, the Pope is confused. And I do think that he has a certain predisposition to support Marxists. And here's what I mean by that. I think it comes out of an experience that he had when he was in high school, where a professor of his, who was a Marxist, would give him books on Marx to read. And later on, in Argentina, she disappeared, and her daughter was killed as well. I think he had a great deal of empathy for her and was shocked by that. And as best I can tell, that plays itself out in giving excessive leeway to people like Lula. His statements recently about Lula, from what I understand of the situation, are completely wrong. I think also his quietness about the persecution of the church in China in the face of this crackdown on the people in Hong Kong, in particular Jimmy Lai, who's one of us. He would be here on his own if he were free. I assure you would enjoy Jimmy. Jimmy cried when he described reading Hayek for the first time. But he's in jail now as a billionaire, could have left China at any time he wanted to, but wanted to stay to defend freedom, where the Chinese and the Pope has said nothing about this. Or Venezuela, not near enough, or Nicaragua, not near enough of what could be said, or Cuba. All of the examples of socialist governments, he's quite prepared to give them a pass, or let them have time to develop.
We have the trailer of his documentary, which was produced by Acton, and the screens in the main room. Yeah, so please, everyone, feel free to watch.
Mark your calendars for April 16th. That's when we're going to release it on the World Wide Web.
Great.
So you'll get to see the entire documentary. I think you'll find it really moving.
Great. Well, you mentioned that the Pope think that economics is boring, and earlier you said that the leftists they like the moral reasons, and sometimes they don't see the concrete reasons for the beliefs. And we see it's very difficult to get into culture, and cultural sector all over the world is very dominated by ideologies. How can we fight against that?
If we're going to fight culturally, and I think we have to fight culturally, we can't just fight with ideas, because, I mean, if it was just the idea, all we have to do is point to history and show how socialism has failed anywhere it's been seriously tried. I think we have to be creative, and we have to present ideas on multiple levels. So the abstract ideas are important, but then we have to move, and by the way, Hayek speaks about this in his book, in his essay on the intellectuals and socialism. He says we need to influence second-hand dealers in ideas, by which he means the people who are writing the novels, the journalists. He even mentions clergy in that number. I would add the artists and the filmmakers, the storytellers, because what moves people isn't just A plus A equals B, or however you want to put it in a syllogism, but the stories that animate. Because we are not just rational beings, we are also imaginative beings, and we can learn a lot from the imagination. And I think those are things that we need to do, and we need to have courage of our own convictions, and we also need to be winsome. You know, winsome is when you're disagreeing with someone, but you're still kind to them. That's very disarming. The left likes to be very mad. In fact, ideologues of any kind are always very, very angry. And I think if we can just be a little kinder to one another without compromising the truth. I mean, as a pastor, it's always been my policy to be very, very gentle with people, but ruthless with the truth. And I think that's what we have to do.
Thank you. There's a question from Luciano Blanc. Does not the Protestant and the Catholic Church have different views on capitalism and private property? As seen in the condemnation of interests from the medieval Catholic Church, while the Protestants defend interests and private property, as described by Max Weber.
Well, I think it's too simplistic to say that Catholicism has one view of the economy and Protestants have one view of the economy, and that those are in opposition to one another. I think you have trends and thinking on the part of Protestants that are similar to some left-wing Catholic views, and you have the opposite. You've had that throughout history. There are several very good scholarly books to read on interest, and I think that the question of usury and that. I think that the church has very clearly backed off that and never taught that, as I understood it, dogmatically at any point. It said that in these circumstances and those circumstances it might be morally problematic, that there is a kind of excessive interest. How that should be adjudicated, I think, has been left open. And especially if you read the scholastics, the writers that you mentioned at the beginning from the School of Salamanca, you'll find a varied way of thinking. You know, the inventors of modern scientific economics, if you want to call it that, that's what Joseph Schumpeter calls it, were the scholastics. It wasn't Adam Smith. It was the scholastic theologians as they were grappling with moral questions, and they talk about interest and wage rates and just prices and inflation even. So I think it's much more complicated than just saying Protestants have one view and Catholics have another view. I think it's a very rich history for all of this.
Great. Well, there are questions from Luis. You could build a different view from the left and the environment that you were in through reason and search for knowledge. How that's so rare? How could you get more institutes such as Acton and more initiatives to promote free market and faith?
How can we do it?
Yes, more.
How can we do it? Just do it. It's what Nike says, just do it. I mean, if there are people here interested in these kinds of ideas, don't wait for anybody's permission. You're free people. I mean, of course, you're under a socialist regime right now, so you're maybe not that free, but you'll find very creative ways of being able to propose these ideas. I think the first thing you need to do is read. You need to understand the argument whole, so not just in pieces, and you have to love the truth. And then you have to be a little courageous and go out there and say it. You know, we have heard for years that, as I started when I said that the notion is that Christianity, were the early Christians were socialists. Winston Churchill said in a speech, something I think that answers it. Write this down, you're going to like this. He said, the socialism of the early church, because they shared their wealth, they were generous with one another, the socialism of the early church said, all that is mine is yours. The modern socialists say, all that is yours is mine. And that's the difference. Christianity is radical and transformative because it transforms the human heart. That's Christianity at its best. At its worst is when it's attempted to take the power of the state. Christ needs to rule not in the capitals of politicians, but in the hearts of believers.
Great. From all your parables, the 13 parables, the one that I liked most was the Good Samaritan. And we have 5 people, a victim, 3 robbers, and the Good Samaritan. We don't have the state at all. The state is not present in any moment. And all those are private person. All those are the market. And 3 robbed the man, but only 1 helped him. And what distinguished them, the 2 group of people, was the moral. May we have our thought on that parable?
That's a beautiful parable, and what's strange about it is that parable, the Good Samaritan, one of the most well-known parables, is very often used as the defense of the welfare state, right? This is the welfare state. This is not the welfare state. The whole point of this parable is that this Samaritan has compassion that's personal. He picks him up, he mends his wounds with the things that he has at his disposal. He puts him on his beast. You left out one person in the parable, the innkeeper. He's running a business. And the Samaritan goes to him and says, here's this man and he has to pay for it. He says, here's some money, you take care of him, and then he puts himself in debt. He says, when I return, if you pay more than when I left you, I'll reimburse you for it. It's a wonderful story of the intimacy of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. And all the more moving in that the Samaritan was the alien. He was on the margins of society. It was the priest and the Levite, the religious leaders, who left the man in his need. So I find that to be a very moving model for what it is to be a Christian in the world.
Great. Well, one of the challenge that people, the Catholic and religious people feel today is the more moral relativism, in which people try to adapt the faith and the current life. May you have your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, people are going to approach life differently. We're not all going to agree with one another. I believe in a given set of moral ethics. I'm a traditional Catholic. I believe what the Church says about all of these kinds of things. But I don't think it is wise, and I don't seek to impose that belief upon other people. I think that each person has to work out their salvation. Each person has to respond to the truth as it is given. And we will all do that at various degrees. The fact that I believe in God doesn't mean that I have all the answers to all of the questions. So it's a question of proposing the truth and not imposing the truth. I had this conversation with Milton Friedman many years ago because he was very nervous. He said, you know, when religious people say they have the truth, I hear the Inquisition. And I said, but what if the truth we hear says that I'm not allowed to impose it upon you? And he said, well, that might be a different matter. So. Should I tell you a story about Mary Rothbard?
Sure, yeah.
Some people know Murray Rothbard. Do you know Murray Rothbard?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
I was with him at a conference once, and we sat down and had lunch. And Murray was very interesting. He was a real Aristotelian and Thomist in many ways, but an atheist. And as we were talking, I saw all of this, and I said, Murray, you're so close. You're so close. Why don't you? And there was a glass of water. I took the glass of water. I said, let me baptize you now. And he laughed. He said, Father, he said, I don't believe in God, but I believe Mary was his mother.
There's a question from Pedro Giaconi. Does the state has to guarantee conditions of health, education, and life quality?
Well, at the risk of offending my anarchist friends, I am not an anarchist. I believe in a properly limited state. And so I think there are certain basic conditions the state needs to guarantee. I think the normative way in which the state can guarantee the well-being of people is first and foremost to protect human freedom and the right to private property. Because if you don't have human freedom and the right to private property, you're not going to resolve any of the other problems that exist in society. And I believe, and this is in accord with the principle of subsidiarity, that the needs that human beings have are best met at the most local level of their existence. So that if I have a need, the first people who should come to my aid are my family, or my parish, or my neighbors, or my extended family, or mediating institutions in society. And then, if there's a manifest failure at that level, then I think you go up to a municipality or a city, and then maybe a state, and even maybe a national action, but temporarily and not as a substitute. The principle of subsidiarity says that we mustn't substitute for the natural society. People do not rise out of poverty because of wealth redistribution. Charity exists for emergency circumstances. The normative way in which people rise out of poverty, and I know this doesn't sound very romantic, is simply having access to business, having access to work. And the best thing the state can do, if they're going to help the common good, is to have a legal system that is transparent, a rule of law, the protection of private property and human liberty, and clear the ground for people to cooperate with one another peacefully. That's the most potent thing if we're really interested in the most vulnerable.
There's a question from Ecclesan. Well, we are streaming on YouTube, so I don't know if all those questions are from here or from the internet, but we are being streamed right now. What do you think about socialist country that goes in a communist direction? And some of them, the governors, increase their authority over their population. And how do you see Brazil on that path?
You very well could be on that path, I'm sorry to say. I think there are many nations like that. Lord Acton is probably most well known for having said power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you get into the logic of accumulating resources, when the state does that, it leaves less resources at the most local level for people to solve their own problems, so the crises become greater and greater. And so you move in the direction from maybe a kind of corporatist thing to a socialist thing to a totalitarian thing. The one thing we learned that Mises knew in 1921 was that socialism can't calculate, and if it can't calculate, it will collapse. The problem is, you can't sit back and be satisfied with that because, you know, sometimes it takes a century for it to collapse, and that leaves a great deal of disaster in the wake. So I think that from what I can see of Brazil, you're in a moment of great crisis. But on the other hand, I see this room full of people who don't have to be here, who have paid to come here, who are thinking people, who have listened to this talk and will listen to many other talks. This gives me hope that you can use the pockets of freedom that still exist in your society to ensure that Brazil will be free. Because Brazilian people are creative people. And you're sitting on a mound of resources that the world needs. It needs your work, it needs your discovery, it needs your entrepreneurship. And all you need to do all of that is your freedom.
There's a very good question from Luis Alberto Bins. Which of the parables would apply of the contradictory situation in which the Fed, the Federal Reserve, adopted in the last week, in which he created money in a very low cost, putting more money in the economic, and is it a kind of anti-God, of a market anti-God, in which create more money, putting in a very artificial way?
Yeah, the difficult part of that question is which of the parables exemplifies that.
I bet you don't have to choose between the 13, among the 13 you
no,
can
I'm
choose
trying to think
the whole Bible.
Let me take a rain check on the specific text. I don't want to just come up with a superficial answer to that question because it's a good question. But the philosophical premise is very important. People need to understand that Fed policies are predicated on small groups of people who think they know what they don't know. And rather than allowing a market to operate, to reveal where the real gaps are, where the real lack of resources are, and allow prices to rise to reflect that scarcity, because when something is scarce, it's more expensive. And when you substitute a small group of people who are politically appointed and operating based on that cronyism, you have a very dangerous situation. And probably the most deceitful thing about all of this is that it can happen without people even knowing that it's happening. The money you have in your pocket or in your bank account can be diminished in its real value simply by the fiat of the government by printing more money. And I just did think of, in the Bible, where this applies, is not a parable, but it's the commands in the book of Leviticus against weighting scales dishonestly. You may not put your thumb on the scale, it says in Deuteronomy, when you're trading goods. And you might argue that Jesus' encounter with the money changers in the temple had something to do with inflated currencies as well, but that's a longer argument. I handle a little bit of that in the book.
Great. Father, thank you. When you mentioned the Argentina, when I asked you about the Pope, I forgot to say that we have a huge delegation from Argentina who is here.
Oh, I'm in trouble now.
I'm sure once they hear your words, they will be inspired and will be able to return to Argentina with new thought and rebuild their country as they deserve. Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Obrigado a todos. Temos o livro A Economia das Parábolas à venda no stand da LVM. A R$40, preço promocional do Fórum da Liberdade. Aproveitem e adquiram a obra. Obrigado a todos.
Obrigado. Thank you.